Get up. You people don't sit here. The words cut through the afternoon air like a snapped wire, sharp and sudden, loud enough to make conversations falter and heads turn in uneasy curiosity. Deputy Ryan Collins stood over the bench, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing impatiently toward the elderly woman seated beneath the faded bus stop sign. The sun hung low over the asphalt, casting long, slanted shadows across the cracked pavement, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The distant hum of traffic, the murmur of voices, even the wind that had been stirring loose paper along the curb. Evelyn Carter did not move right away. Her hands, thin and steady despite the years etched into them, remained folded over a worn canvas bag resting in her lap. The bag looked older than some of the people gathered there, its edges softened by time, its fabric faded but carefully mended. A small corner had come loose, revealing the edge of something inside. What looked like the spine of a book and the corner of a photograph, both tucked away with quiet care. She lifted her eyes slowly, not startled, not confused, just present, as if she had heard those words before in another place, another time, and had learned long ago not to let them shake her. Around them, a few people shifted uncomfortably. A young man near the vending machine lowered his phone slightly, unsure whether to keep recording or look away. A woman holding a grocery bag tightened her grip, the plastic crinkling softly in the thickening silence. No one spoke. No one stepped forward. Because Ryan Collins wasn't just another man raising his voice. He was authority, a badge catching the sunlight on his chest, a presence that made people hesitate before choosing a side. I said get up, he repeated, slower this time, his tone edged with impatience rather than anger, as if the delay itself was an inconvenience he refused to tolerate. Evelyn's fingers brushed lightly against the fabric of her bag, a small, almost absent motion, like someone grounding themselves without needing anyone to notice. Then, carefully, she leaned forward, not in submission, but in deliberation, as if each movement mattered. The bench creaked faintly under her weight, the sound barely audible, yet somehow echoing in the stillness that had settled over the bus stop. She did not rush. She did not argue. She simply began to rise, her posture straightening inch by inch, her gaze steady as it met his. For a fleeting second, something unreadable passed through her expression, not fear, not defiance, but something quieter, deeper, like memory brushing against the present. The sunlight caught the silver in her hair, outlining her profile in a soft glow that stood in quiet contrast to the tension surrounding her. Ryan shifted his stance, impatience tightening his jaw, as if the calm in front of him unsettled him more than resistance ever could. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn sounded, sharp and brief, then faded into the background like everything else that no longer seemed to matter in that moment. Evelyn stood fully now, her hands still resting lightly on the bag, her shoulders squared not in challenge, but in dignity. And as the silence stretched just a little longer than anyone expected, the air itself felt heavier, as if something unseen had begun to tilt, slowly, quietly, in a direction no one there yet understood. Evelyn did not rush to leave the space, even after she had risen to her feet, because the bench behind her was not just a place to sit, but part of a quiet routine she had followed for years, every Tuesday and Thursday, just before the number 42 bus arrived at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, a schedule she knew better than most of the people who came and went without noticing the pattern of their own days. She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag over her shoulder with a small, practiced motion, her fingers brushing over the frayed stitching as if confirming that everything inside remained exactly where it belonged. The old book, the photograph, the things that anchored her in ways no one around her could see. Her shoes, simple and well-worn, pressed lightly against the pavement as she took a single step back from the bench, creating space not out of fear, but out of choice, as though she understood that dignity sometimes meant stepping aside without surrendering who you were. The air felt warmer now, heavier, and the faint scent of gasoline drifted in from the street as a pickup truck rolled past, its engine low and steady, a reminder that life outside this moment had not stopped, even if everything here seemed suspended. Ryan watched her closely, his posture still firm, but something in his expression had shifted, not enough for anyone to name it. just a flicker of uncertainty that came and went too quickly to hold on to. He had expected resistance, or at least hesitation, something he could push against, something that justified his tone, his presence, his control of the situation, but what stood in front of him instead was calm, measured, and unshaken in a way that did not fit the script he had written in his mind. Evelyn lifted her chin slightly, her gaze steady but not confrontational, and for a brief second, her eyes moved past him, scanning the faces around them, not searching for help, not asking for sympathy, simply acknowledging the witnesses who had become part of something they had not intended to join. The young man with the phone raised it again, this time more deliberately, as if he understood that what he was capturing might matter later, though he could not yet explain why. A breeze moved through the bus stop, light but noticeable, lifting a loose strand of Evelyn's silver hair and carrying with it the distant sound of a train horn somewhere across town, low and drawn out, like a memory stretching across years. "You need to move along," Ryan said, his voice lower now, less sharp, but still edged with authority that he was not ready to relinquish. Evelyn nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and turned slightly as if to comply, but her movement paused halfway, her hand resting again on the canvas bag, her thumb tracing the edge of the photograph hidden inside. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, like there were words forming just beneath the surface, but instead she let the silence speak, the kind of silence that did not retreat or collapse, but held its ground in a way that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. The bus stop sign rattled faintly as the breeze shifted again, the metal pole vibrating just enough to create a soft, hollow sound that echoed the tension no one could quite release. Somewhere behind them, a child asked a question in a whisper, quickly hushed by a parent who did not want to draw attention, and the ordinary rhythm of the world pressed gently against the edges of this moment, waiting for it to resolve. Evelyn finally took another step, slow and deliberate, not away from the situation, but through it, her presence leaving a quiet imprint that lingered even as she moved, like the fading warmth of sunlight on concrete after the sun had slipped behind the buildings. And though nothing outwardly dramatic had happened, though no raised voices followed and no sudden interruptions broke the scene, there was a subtle shift in the air, something unseen but undeniable, as if the balance of the moment had tilted just enough to set something larger into motion, something that had not yet revealed itself, but was already on its way. Ryan remained where he was for a moment after Evelyn moved past him, his boots planted firmly on the pavement, but his focus no longer anchored in the authority he had just exercised, instead drifting in a way he did not immediately understand, as if something subtle had slipped out of alignment without asking his permission. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight again, flashing briefly, but the shine felt different now, less like a symbol of control and more like something being observed from the outside, weighed quietly by every pair of eyes still lingering at the bus stop. He cleared his throat and adjusted his stance, glancing around at the small crowd, noticing for the first time how still they had become, how their silence carried something heavier than simple compliance. A man near the curb looked away too quickly when their eyes almost met, while the young man with the phone did not lower it this time, his grip steady, his posture firmer, as though he had crossed an invisible line between passive observer and unwilling witness. Ryan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving his chest with a faint tension that he masked by reaching toward his radio, fingers brushing against it without actually pressing the button, a habitual motion that usually grounded him, reminded him of procedure, of structure, of the rules that defined his role. But the rules felt less clear in this moment, not broken, not challenged outright, just slightly out of reach, like a word on the tip of his tongue that refused to form. He turned his head just enough to follow Evelyn's movement as she walked along the sidewalk, her pace unhurried, her figure steady against the backdrop of passing cars and distant storefronts. There was nothing remarkable about the way she moved, nothing that demanded attention, and yet the space she left behind seemed altered, as if her presence had quietly rearranged something in the air that could not be put back the way it was. A low rumble signaled the approach of the bus in the distance, its engine growing louder as it rounded the corner 2 blocks away, the familiar route number glowing faintly through the windshield. Normally, that sight would have marked a simple transition, people boarding, seats filling, conversations resuming, the day continuing without interruption. But now, the approaching bus felt like a marker of time catching up, of something unresolved being carried forward whether anyone was ready or not. Ryan shifted again, this time more noticeably, one foot scraping lightly against the concrete, the sound small but sharp in the quiet that still lingered. He straightened his shoulders, attempting to reclaim the posture that had defined him moments earlier, but the effort felt deliberate, almost forced, as if he were stepping back into a role that no longer fit as easily as it had before. Behind him, the woman with the grocery bag finally exhaled, a soft release of breath she had been holding, and the plastic in her hands rustled again, breaking the stillness just enough to remind everyone that the world had not stopped, only paused. The bus pulled closer now, its brakes beginning to hiss faintly as it slowed, and a reflection flickered across the windows, catching Ryan's image for a split second before distorting it with the angle of the glass. He did not notice the reflection itself, but he felt something like it, a fleeting sense of being seen from a perspective he had not chosen. Evelyn reached the edge of the sidewalk near the bus stop sign further down, her hand adjusting the strap of her bag once more, her posture unchanged, her calm intact. She did not look back. She did not need to. And as the bus came to a gradual stop with a low mechanical sigh, doors folding open with a familiar metallic rhythm, the moment that had begun so abruptly now stretched into something quieter but far more enduring, a shift that did not announce itself, yet refused to disappear. Ryan remained standing, watching, the weight of something unnamed settling just beneath the surface, subtle but undeniable, as if the consequences of a single moment had already begun to move, slowly and steadily, toward him, even before he understood what they would become. The bus doors folded open with a soft mechanical sigh, releasing a faint burst of cool air that carried the scent of worn vinyl seats and city miles. And for a moment no one moved, as if the simple act of stepping forward had become heavier than it should have been. Evelyn approached the entrance without hesitation, her steps measured and steady, the edge of her shoe touching the first metal step with a quiet certainty that did not ask for permission. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a name tag that read Luis, glanced up briefly, his gaze lingering on her just a second longer than usual, not out of suspicion, but recognition, as though he had seen her many times before and understood something unspoken about her presence. She offered a small nod, the kind that carried gratitude without needing words, and reached into her canvas bag, her fingers moving with familiar precision until they found a folded transit pass tucked between the pages of the old book. The card was slightly worn at the edges, but clean, carefully kept, and she held it out with a calm hand that did not tremble. Luis accepted it, scanning it with a soft electronic beep that echoed lightly through the bus, and returned it without question, his expression softening just enough to suggest respect rather than routine. Behind her, a few passengers began to shift, the spell of stillness finally breaking as the rhythm of the day resumed, but more slowly than before, as if everyone was aware that something had changed, even if they could not yet name it. Evelyn stepped inside and moved down the aisle, her gaze sweeping once across the empty seats before choosing one halfway back by the window, where the sunlight filtered through the glass in long, warm lines that stretched across the faded fabric. She placed her bag carefully on her lap, her hand resting on it as if anchoring herself once again, and turned her face slightly toward the window, watching the reflection of the outside world ripple faintly across the glass. Outside, Ryan remained near the original bench, his posture still upright but no longer commanding, his attention drawn not just to Evelyn boarding the bus, but to the subtle shift in how the people around him now carried themselves. Conversations did not resume with the same ease, and the usual casual glances toward him were replaced with something quieter, more deliberate, as if the badge on his chest had lost a layer of unquestioned authority in the span of a few minutes. He took a step forward, then stopped, his foot settling back against the pavement with a faint scrape that sounded louder than it should have. The bus engine rumbled gently, a low, steady vibration that filled the space between movement and departure. And as the doors remained open for just a few seconds longer, Ryan found himself looking toward the interior, toward the figure seated by the window, her outline softened by the light, but unmistakably composed. There was no accusation in her posture, No lingering defiance, just a quiet stillness that seemed to exist beyond the moment that had just unfolded. Luis glanced toward the mirror above his seat, checking the aisle, then shifted his hand toward the control panel, ready to close the doors, but he paused for a brief second, his eyes flicking toward Ryan through the open frame of the bus entrance, as if giving him a final opportunity to act, to say something, to reclaim or redefine the moment in a way that had not yet been decided. Ryan did not move. His hand hovered near his belt again, fingers brushing the edge of his radio, but he did not reach for it this time. The silence between him and the bus stretched thin, fragile, like something that could either break or transform depending on what came next. Then, without another signal, the doors began to close, folding inward with a soft, deliberate motion that sealed the space between inside and out. The sound was not loud, but it carried weight, final in a way that lingered. As the bus pulled away from the curb, its tires rolling slowly over the uneven pavement, Evelyn's reflection shifted across the window, blending with the passing street, her figure becoming part of the moving world rather than the still one Ryan remained in. He watched until the bus merged into traffic, until the shape of it became just another vehicle among many, and only then did he lower his gaze, the space around him returning to normal sounds and movement, yet feeling unmistakably altered, as if something had been set in motion that would not stop simply because the moment had ended. The bus disappeared into the flow of traffic, its outline swallowed by the rhythm of the city, yet the space it left behind did not return to what it had been, not for Ryan, not for the people who had stood there watching, and not for the quiet weight now settling into the air around him. He shifted his stance again, this time more slowly, as if aware that every movement carried more meaning than it should have, his boots pressing against the pavement with a heaviness that had not been there before. The conversations that began to rise around him were softer, fragmented, like people testing whether it was safe to return to normal, but their voices did not carry the same ease, and their eyes did not linger on him with the same unquestioned acceptance. The young man with the phone finally lowered it, but not before glancing down at the screen, his thumb hovering as if deciding what to do next, whether to save, to share, or to simply hold on to what he had captured. Ryan noticed that glance, and for a brief second, something tightened in his chest, subtle but unmistakable, like a warning he could not quite place. He turned away from the bus stop, taking a few steps toward the curb, his hand brushing once more against his radio, but this time the gesture felt less like habit and more like uncertainty, as though he was considering whether to speak into it, to report something, or to prevent something from being reported about him. He did not press the button. Instead, he let his hand fall back to his side, fingers curling slightly, the tension settling into them without release. A car slowed at the intersection nearby, its driver glancing briefly in his direction before continuing on, and that brief look carried a different weight now, not fear, not respect, but something closer to quiet evaluation. The badge on his chest still caught the light, still reflected the same shine, but it no longer felt like a shield against judgment, and that shift, however small, pressed against him in a way he could not ignore. Behind him, the woman with the grocery bag adjusted her grip again and began to walk, her steps deliberate as she moved past the bench without sitting, choosing instead to keep going, as if the place itself held a memory she did not want to linger in. The bus stop, once just another point along the route, now felt marked, not by anything visible, but by the echo of what had unfolded, a quiet imprint that would remain long after the moment itself faded. Ryan exhaled slowly, his breath steady but heavier than before, and turned his gaze down the street where the bus had gone, as if expecting to see something follow it back, some resolution that would restore the balance he was used to. Nothing came. Only the steady movement of traffic, the distant sound of engines, and the ordinary pace of a day that did not pause for anyone. Yet beneath that surface, something had already shifted beyond his reach. The young man with the phone took a step back, then another, creating distance not just physically, but emotionally, as if he had decided where he stood without saying it out loud. Another passerby glanced at Ryan and then quickly looked away, but not before a flicker of recognition passed through their expression, the kind that suggested a story forming, one that would not stay contained to this corner for long. Ryan straightened his shoulders again, attempting to reassert the posture that had defined him, but the movement lacked the certainty it once carried, and for the first time, the weight of his uniform felt noticeable, not just as fabric and metal, but as something that could be questioned. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against his sleeve, carrying with it the faint echo of the bus engine now far down the road. And in that moment, he understood something without fully naming it, that the situation had not ended when the doors closed, that it had only moved forward, beyond his control, into places he could not yet see. He remained standing there, in the same spot where it had all begun, but the ground beneath him no longer felt the same, and the consequences, quiet and unseen, had already begun to take shape, moving steadily toward him whether he was ready or not. The afternoon light softened as the sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the sidewalk where Ryan still stood, the warmth of the day fading into something quieter, more reflective, as if the city itself was easing into a slower breath. The usual rhythm had returned on the surface, cars passing, footsteps echoing lightly against concrete, distant voices blending into the background. Yet for Ryan, everything felt slightly out of sync, like a familiar song playing just a fraction off beat. He finally stepped away from the bus stop, his movement deliberate, almost cautious, as though the ground beneath him required more attention than before. Each step carried a subtle awareness he had never needed, a quiet weight that settled into his shoulders and did not lift. The badge on his chest, still catching the last traces of sunlight, no longer felt invisible to him. It pressed against his uniform in a way he could feel now, a constant reminder not just of authority, but of expectation, of scrutiny, of something larger than the moment that had already passed. He reached the edge of the crosswalk and paused, the signal blinking from red to white, the small illuminated figure inviting him forward, yet he did not move immediately. Instead, he glanced down the street again, toward where the bus had gone, as if searching for something unresolved, something left behind that might still be reclaimed. There was nothing there but distance and motion. Across the street, a storefront window reflected his figure back at him, slightly distorted by the glass, the lines of his uniform bending with the angle, and for a brief moment, he held that reflection, studying it without fully realizing he was doing so. It looked the same stance, the same uniform, the same badge, yet it felt different, as though something essential had shifted beneath the surface, something not visible but impossible to ignore. A breeze moved through the intersection, cooler now, carrying with it the faint scent of evening and the distant hum of a city preparing to transition into night. Ryan exhaled slowly, the breath steady but deeper than before, and stepped into the crosswalk, the sound of his boots against the painted lines marking his path in a way he could hear more clearly than usual. Halfway across, a car idled at the light, its driver watching him for a second longer than necessary before looking away, and that small interaction, barely a moment, carried a quiet weight that lingered. He reached the other side and continued walking, his pace measured, his posture upright but no longer rigid, as if the edges of his certainty had softened just enough to let something else in. Behind him, the bus stop stood as it always had, unremarkable to anyone who had not been there, yet holding within it a moment that had already begun to ripple outward, unseen but not unfelt. Ryan's hand lifted briefly toward his radio again, fingers brushing the surface, but instead of reaching for it, he let his hand fall, choosing silence over explanation, whether by instinct or uncertainty, he could not tell. The sky above shifted in color, pale blue giving way to warmer tones, and the first hints of evening light stretched across the buildings, reflecting off windows in soft, muted glows. As he walked further down the block, the sounds of the city blended together again, more familiar now, but still carrying an undercurrent that had not been there before, something subtle yet persistent, like a question left unanswered. He did not stop, did not turn back, but the moment followed him, quiet and steady, settling into his thoughts in a way that would not fade with distance or time, a silent turning point that had not announced itself with force, yet had changed the direction of everything that would come next. By the time Ryan reached the end of the block, the sky had shifted into a deeper shade of amber, the kind of late afternoon light that softened edges and stretched reflections across every surface, and yet nothing about it felt warm to him anymore, not in the way it had just an hour before. His steps slowed without him deciding to slow them, as if something inside him was resisting the simple act of moving forward. And when his radio finally cracked to life with a burst of static, the sound cut through the quiet in a way that made his shoulders tense instinctively. Unit 12, come in. The voice said, calm but firm, carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to being answered without delay. Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand lifting toward the radio before pressing the button, his voice steady when it came out, but lacking the automatic confidence it usually carried. This is Unit 12, he replied. There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to feel intentional, before the voice returned, slightly lower now, more measured. We need you back at the precinct. Now. No explanation followed, no additional detail, just the weight of instruction hanging in the air between them. Ryan's grip on the radio tightened slightly before he released the button, the silence that followed heavier than the words themselves. He stood still for a moment, the sounds of the city continuing around him, cars passing, footsteps echoing, distant sirens blending into the background, but all of it felt muted, as if he were hearing it from behind a thin wall. He did not need to ask why. Something in the tone, in the timing, in the way the call had come so soon after everything that had happened, told him more than any explanation would have. He turned slowly, his gaze drifting back down the street toward the direction of the bus route. Though there was nothing left to see there, only distance and fading light. A passing reflection in a store window caught his movement again, his figure briefly overlapping with the glow of a television screen inside the shop, and for a split second, he saw himself not as he felt, but as he appeared, uniform intact, posture upright, everything outwardly unchanged. But the image did not hold. It shifted as he moved, distorting slightly, blending into something less certain. The weight in his chest deepened, not sharp, not overwhelming, just steady and undeniable, like a truth settling into place whether he was ready for it or not. He exhaled slowly, then began walking back the way he had come, each step more deliberate than before, his pace no longer guided by routine, but by something quieter, heavier, something that did not rush but did not allow him to stop either. The bus stop came back into view gradually, the bench now empty, the space ordinary again to anyone passing by, yet marked in a way only those who had been there could feel. He did not slow as he passed it, but he did not look away either, his eyes lingering just long enough to acknowledge the place where everything had shifted. The wind moved lightly through the street, carrying with it the faint echo of voices, of movement, of a moment that had already begun to spread beyond its origin. Somewhere, unseen, decisions were being made, conversations unfolding, perspectives forming, all moving toward a point he could not yet see but was already approaching. Ryan reached his patrol car, the metal still warm from the day's heat, and paused with his hand on the door handle, the surface reflecting the dimming sky and his own outline, now darker, less defined. For a brief moment, he did not open the door. He simply stood there, feeling the quiet settle around him, understanding without words that whatever waited for him at the precinct was not just about procedure or report or routine, but about something deeper, something that had already begun long before he heard his name over the radio. Then, with a steady motion, he opened the door and got in, the sound of it closing firm but not loud, and as the engine turned over with a low, familiar rumble, he pulled away from the curb, driving not just toward a building, but toward the unfolding consequence of a moment that would not be left behind. The precinct building stood in the fading light like it always had, solid, familiar, its brick exterior catching the last traces of the sun as Ryan pulled into the lot, the tires of his patrol car rolling slowly over the worn asphalt marked with faded white lines. He parked without rushing, the engine idling for a moment longer than necessary before he finally turned the key, the quiet that followed settling in deeper than expected. For a few seconds, he remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed ahead at the glass doors that reflected the evening sky in muted tones of gold and gray. Inside, movement was visible, silhouettes passing behind the glass, the routine of the station continuing as it always did. Yet something about it felt different now, as if the building itself held an awareness of what had already begun to unfold. Ryan stepped out of the car, closing the door with a controlled motion, not loud, not soft, just final, and adjusted his uniform out of habit, though the gesture felt less automatic than it once had. The air had cooled slightly, a light breeze moving through the lot, brushing against his sleeve as he made his way toward the entrance, each step measured, each breath steady, but carrying a weight he could no longer ignore. As he pushed the door open, the familiar scent of polished floors and paper filled the space, along with the low hum of voices and ringing phones, the background rhythm of a place built on order and response. A few heads turned as he entered, not abruptly, not in unison, but enough to register, enough for him to notice the shift in attention, the quiet recognition that followed him across the room. It was not loud, not confrontational, but it was there, subtle and undeniable. He nodded once to a colleague at the front desk, but the exchange lacked its usual ease, the moment passing without words as if both of them understood that something unspoken stood between them. "Collins," a voice called. From further down the hallway, firm but not raised, carrying the weight of authority without needing volume. Ryan turned toward it, his posture straightening instinctively as he recognized the voice. Captain Harris standing near the doorway of his office, his expression composed but serious, the kind that did not invite delay. Ryan approached, his steps steady, though the distance felt longer than it should have, each footfall echoing faintly against the polished floor. As he reached the doorway, Harris stepped aside slightly, gesturing for him to enter without a word, the movement controlled, deliberate, and when the door closed behind them with a soft click, the sounds of the station faded into a distant murmur. The office was quiet, lit by a desk lamp that cast a warm but focused light across a stack of papers and a computer screen that glowed softly in the dimming room. Harris remained standing for a moment, his gaze fixed on Ryan, not harsh, not accusatory, but steady in a way that demanded attention. Then, without speaking, he reached toward the desk and turned the monitor slightly. The screen displayed a paused video, the image clear enough to recognize instantly, the bus stop, the bench, the angle of the camera unmistakable. Ryan's reflection flickered faintly across the screen as he looked at it, overlapping with the frozen frame of himself from earlier, the two images merging for a brief second before separating again. Harris pressed a key, and the video moved, the sound low but audible, capturing every word, every movement, every moment exactly as it had happened, but now seen from a distance, from a perspective Ryan had not experienced at the time. The room remained silent as it played, the only sound the faint audio from the screen, and when it ended, Harris did not speak immediately. He simply let the silence sit, letting the weight of what had been seen settle fully into the space between them. Ryan stood still, his hands at his sides, his gaze fixed forward, not avoiding the screen, not looking away, but no longer seeing it the same way. For the first time, the moment was not his to control, not his to interpret, not his to move past. It was something else now, something shared, something examined, something that carried consequences beyond the few minutes in which it had begun. And in that quiet office, with the last light of day fading beyond the window, the realization did not arrive all at once, but it settled slowly, firmly, like a truth that had been waiting just beneath the surface, now impossible to ignore. The room remained still long after the video ended, the glow of the monitor dimming slightly as the screen returned to a paused frame, frozen on a moment that no longer belonged to the past alone, but had already begun shaping what came next. Ryan did not speak. He stood there, shoulders squared but no longer rigid, his gaze steady yet quieter, as if the weight he carried had finally settled into a form he could not shift away from. Captain Harris exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and stepped back toward his desk, not with frustration, not with anger, but with the calm of someone who understood that certain moments did not require raised voices to carry their impact. He rested one hand on the edge of the desk, the other gesturing lightly toward the screen without looking at it again, as though the evidence no longer needed to be replayed. "Take a seat," he said, his tone even, measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Ryan hesitated for the briefest second before moving forward, the chair making a soft sound against the floor as he sat, the motion controlled but deliberate, like every action now required more awareness than before. The silence returned, deeper this time, not empty but filled with something unspoken, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Outside the office, the faint hum of the precinct continued. Phones ringing, footsteps passing, voices exchanging information, the world moving forward as it always did. Yet inside this room, time seemed to slow, stretching just enough for reflection to take hold. Harris finally spoke again, his voice steady, carrying neither accusation nor comfort, just truth. "What you did out there," he began, pausing briefly as if choosing his words with care. "That is not what this badge stands for." The words hung in the air, simple, direct, impossible to dismiss. Ryan's eyes lowered slightly, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement, the kind that came without defense, without explanation. For the first time, there was no immediate response forming, no instinct to justify or redirect, just a quiet acceptance of what had been seen, of what had been recorded, of what could not be undone. Harris continued, his tone unchanged, but carrying a deeper weight now. "There are consequences for this," he said, not as a threat, but as a fact, something already in motion, something that did not depend on emotion or interpretation. Ryan nodded once, a small, controlled movement that carried more meaning than words could have, and in that gesture, something shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, a recognition settling into place. The room grew quieter still, the last light of day slipping through the window behind the desk, casting long shadows across the floor, the edges of the furniture softening as evening took hold. After a moment, Harris stepped back slightly, giving space without dismissing him, and turned his attention briefly toward the window, as if allowing the silence to finish what words could not. Ryan remained seated, his hands resting on his knees, his posture upright but no longer defined by authority alone, something else now present beneath it, something quieter, more grounded. Outside, the sky deepened into shades of blue and gray, the city lights beginning to flicker on one by one, each small point of light marking the continuation of lives moving forward. Somewhere across town, a bus rolled along its route, carrying passengers who had long since settled into their destinations, unaware of the ripple that had followed them from a single stop. And inside that bus, earlier, an elderly woman had sat by the window, her hands resting gently on a worn canvas bag, her reflection moving with the passing streets, calm, steady, unchanged. Back in the office, Ryan slowly rose from the chair, not in defiance, not in urgency, but with a quiet understanding, the kind that did not need to be spoken aloud. He adjusted his uniform once more, the gesture familiar yet different, as if it carried a new meaning now, and without another word, he turned toward the door. The handle felt cool in his hand as he opened it, the sounds of the precinct returning gradually, blending back into the rhythm of the evening. He stepped out into the hallway, the lights softer now, the movement around him steady, and for a brief moment, he paused, not to look back, but to stand still within the weight of what had been set in motion. Then he continued forward, his steps measured, the path ahead uncertain yet undeniable, while behind him, the office door closed quietly, leaving the silence intact, a final echo of a moment that had spoken louder than anything else could have.